Hello and welcome to class. I hope you guys are all doing very well on this first day of summer. Last night was the vernal equinox or summer solstice at around 11:30 p.m. and now we have the longest day of the year today, which might not be as enjoyable since it's been raining, but hopefully it'll let up and we can spend some time outside. So this week we're going over Chapter 8 of the Birkeland, which is on decision making and policy analysis, and I also assigned an article on different types of policy in the policymaking structures in the federal government. However, although I do want you to read the article, it is an optional article for this week, and as such, I will not go over it in the lecture, but I will post the article and the concomitant PowerPoint for you to review at your leisure, throughout the course. And essentially just goes over different types of policies and policy types. And so it was more about last week's readings, so that's why I'm not making it required for this week. And it's a little higher level, but if you're interested in particularly, moving on with political science master's or PhD or public administration's master's or PhD, then it might be of interest to you. So go ahead and read that if you would like. Otherwise, we're just going to go over Chapter 8 of the Birkeland, which is on decision making and policy analysis. And this will be a bit of a quicker video since there's not as much in this chapter. However, as a result of that, and because your policy analysis paper is due on Friday, June 25th, this Friday, by 11:59 p.m., I'm going to make the quiz a little simpler. Maybe just one question will be the whole thing that's worth the 10 points. And I'll let you know probably in this lecture what it'll be on. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions about the policy analysis paper, or if you would like me to review it for you. Although we're already past the point of when I said you would have to get it in for review. So just let me know if you have any specific questions or areas you'd like me to look through. And I'm sure you guys will all do very well on that, as you've been doing very well on the quizzes. So Chapter 8 goes over policy analysis in the policy process, with a brief history of policy analysis, politics, policy, and policy analysis, and modern and dynamic policy analysis, and then we get into a few different theories or models of decision making, such as the rational comprehensive decision making model, bounded rationality, and incrementalism. So in the overview section, Birkeland differentiates between outputs and outcomes, which are two of the things that we measure or are intending to measure in policy analysis and that are relevant to decision-making choices that we make. So outputs are the measurable things an agency or organization produces, such as the number of traffic signals installed, the number of students taught, or the number of restaurants inspected. These are not the same as measures of outcomes, which assess the effects of these outputs. And then outcomes are defined as the substantive results of the implementation of a policy. Outcomes can be intended or unintended, negative or positive. This differs from outputs, which are laws, regulations, rules, and the like, or the effort the government expends to address problems. Excuse me. For example, more teaching hours provided by a school district is an output. The outcome would be, one hopes, an improvement in students' educational achievement. So we see that outputs are kind of the easier to measure, perhaps, usually numerical results of a policy, whereas outcomes are more about the consequences of a policy in terms of what the policy actually was aiming to accomplish and whether it does actually accomplish this. So outputs are things like, related to teaching, how many students I'm teaching. Outcomes would be, how well have the students mastered the material of public policy or public administration. And we note here that there's a difficulty of quantifying, especially outcomes, because there's a question about, what should we be measuring when we're referring to something like an improvement in students' educational achievement? Would we look at, their test scores over time? Would we look at their mastery of certain concepts? Would we look at how well they're able to transmit the information through quizzes and essays and the like? And so there's a question of what are we actually referring to when we are referring to outcomes. Outputs are a little easier to quantify because they generally refer to quantifiable things, such as the number of traffic signals installed, the number of students taught, or the number of restaurants inspected. That's usually easier to measure than outcomes. So I might ask you on the quiz, think of a public policy you're interested in. What are its intended outputs and what are its intended outcomes, or what are the actual outputs or outcomes, and how are they distinct from each other? So then we get into the section policy analysis and the policy process, and we note here that many agencies measure outputs, that is, what they do, and not their effect on particular problems, which would refer to the measure of outcomes. However, we note that it is possible with some care to link actual outcomes to results, but this requires a good causal model of a policy, that is, a model of how the effort expended causes a particular outcome. And so how would we know that a given input yields a given output, to put it in terms of systems theory, which we discussed earlier in the book? So one way to determine this is to spell out your causal model with your inputs and your outputs and your outcomes and see how they link together. And that's, how we can know that the actual outcomes or outputs are linked to the results that were intended by the policy and were enacted through the implementation of the policy. And then now in policy analysis, we're determining essentially if the intended goals of the policy were effectively met by the policy's implementation. And then we define policy analysis as the practice by which policy analysts use various analytic tools, often derived from fields such as operations research, statistics, and economics, to understand the likely outcomes and benefits of particular policy ideas. So it can be forward-looking in the sense that, we're determining from, let's say this law or something like this law or procedure was put into place yesterday, and we're trying to forecast what the likely outcomes or outputs are going to be. Generally, we refer to outcomes as the more comprehensive of the two. And that can be policy analysis. It can also be evaluation, so looking backwards on a policy that was, say, put in place, a year and a half ago, like let's say the coronavirus stimulus payments. And we were looking at what were the intended outcomes of this, or the intended outputs of this kind of policy. And so it would likely be, stimulating the economy and ensuring that Americans who receive stimulus payments, don't fall under their income bracket to a significant degree, maintain their wealth, are able to successfully, pay rent or mortgage, buy groceries, care for their children, etc. And then we would try to link the stimulus payments to those outcomes that I just referred to. So was it successful? In my opinion, the stimulus payments were probably too small to reach some of those grander outcomes, like not falling below a certain level in your income bracket, having more wealth than you did before, or, being able to live effectively in society. We only received, I think, 3 rounds of stimulus payments, of which the most was for $1,400 a person, or $2,800 for a married couple. That's less than the average American makes in a 2-week period or in a month. So it's unlikely that they would lead to those grander outcomes, and I think probably most policy analysis would agree with my analysis. But in any case, it's not really about what my opinion is or whether they were successful. It's more about understanding that this is how policy analysis is conducted. So then we get into a brief history of policy analysis, and we note that the history of a policy analysis goes back as far as the Renaissance into Machiavelli. And, Machiavelli was the author of The Prince, which assessed, how policies could be put in place by generally a monarchic ruler to reach effective outcomes, and how we were to understand power. So that's a really early kind of understanding of policy analysis. And so we have some important moments in the history of policy analysis that are listed in the Birkeland section in chapter 8 here. So we have Muller v. Oregon, which was a case in which the Supreme Court considered a legal brief defending the right of Oregon to regulate the work hours of women. And the brief was an early example of policy analysis, for it contained a great deal of empirical data designed to help support Oregon's decision. So they incorporated in the arguments for Muller v. Oregon, and often in many Supreme Court cases or even lower court cases, a lot of evidence obviously is incorporated. But we generally want to refer to things, objective measures of evidence, like statistics, when conducting especially these greater Supreme Court cases that will have a large effect on society. And so they were trying to determine, if this policy were instituted, how would it change the current state of affairs based on, the negative effects of women working too much or too little in this case. And, what has happened in the past and what is likely to happen in the future if we were to institute this policy. And so the result was the regulation of the permissible working hours or the legal working hours of women. And then during the World Wars and the Great Depression, the number of policy advisors within the government increased, and this makes sense. One of my areas of specialization is world politics, and for my PhD, and obviously when you're in a war or a particularly harmful era like the Great Depression, you're going to want to call on policy advisors to conduct policy analysis to determine, the results of decision-making processes. What ought we to do as a result of, someone attacking us, or as a result of the stock market crashing. This is when policy advisors and policy analysts become really relevant. And then Laswell introduced the policy sciences as an intellectual endeavor, and it was defined as an orientation toward problem solving, and there's a multidisciplinary nature of the policy sciences because they incorporate, elements from economics, from political science, from sociology, from philosophy, etc. And then there was also included in or incorporated in the policy sciences a value component, which is relevant. We go back to the distinction between the normative and the descriptive, or the descriptive and the prescriptive. And policy analysts are generally recommending courses of actions or models of decision making to make actions real. Excuse me. My allergies have been kicked into full effect recently, but anyway, so they're telling their political superiors or their political advisors, what would be a better way to do things, and that has a value component added into it. And then finally, by the 1960s, analytic techniques and computing power began to aid policy analysis. So we were determining better ways to construct decision-making models through, the field of economics and mathematics. And we also had, an increased computer power, which aided with computational models. Hold on one second. Woo! Let's grab my Red Bull. Okay. So then we get into politics, policy, and policy analysis. And we start with Radin. Radin's account of the two cultures of politics and analysis illustrates that politics and analysis have cultures that are distinct and not equal. The political culture puts pressures on the norms of analysis, and in a sense, as the two cultures, they work as master and servant. So why is this the case? Well, in Stone's policy paradox, she begins with pointing out how early policy analysis scholarship and practice was strongly influenced by economics and rationality. However, she notes that there are problems with applying economic and political analysis to policy analysis. And we also note here the importance of democracy in determining, the right course of policy analysis, so counting on, the opinions of voters as well as representatives. And she notes that there are three models of thinking, such as the model of reasoning, the model of society, and the model of policy making. And so these are different kind of eras of policy analysis over time, focusing first on rationality, second on societal norms, and third on the norms or criteria for evaluation of policy making. And then there are also the rational thinking models, which we will go over later. And then she wrote that in reality, the rationality project is more of a normative than a descriptive force. So many policy analysis over, the last 50 years or so, and even still recently, assume that the norms of rationality that are derived from economics and game theory and things like this are the best norms to apply to policy analysis. But as we'll encounter as we're going through the rest of this chapter, there are actually several different models of decision making that all have their merits and their demerits, depending on what you're applying them to. And to state that rationality ought to be the utmost, value in determining how effective or ineffective or, equitable or inequitable a particular policy is through policy analysis, that is only, one opinion of many. And it's only one value of many that ought to be considered, which is why, in our policy analysis papers that we're completing this week, I'm asking you to specify a slew of different criteria to analyze and evaluate your particular policies that you're proposing. But again, the rationality project, as Stone terms it, has a lot of force because it is used normatively. It is used as, something we ought to follow in the policy analysis. And so, there's just a question about whether that should be the case or not. And then we have modern and dynamic policy analysts. And so Radin traces the history of policy analysts using three characters that are varied in the profession in terms of the practitioner's backgrounds, expertise, and goals than what was originally envisioned to be a wholly scientific and technical pursuit motivated by neutral analysis alone. So one of the characters explained in Radin's history of policy analysts using the three characters became interested in a particular policy issue and then sought the education and the position necessary to have influence in that issue. Another person started, with just being solely interested in the scientific and technical pursuit of it and then became a policy analyst. And so we see how people have different motivations and kind of backgrounds and histories, and these all affect how they're going to conduct their policy analysis. So again, it's important when analyzing policy analysis, so analyzing the analysis, to question the motives and the backgrounds and the motivations of the various people who are conducting these policy analyses, such that we can further understand and perhaps criticize or critique, why they're doing this and why they come to particular conclusions instead of others, so we may better understand, the backgrounds behind particular decisions and thus, determine whether we ought to really accept them or we ought to change them or work to change them as, citizens in the United States or as bureaucrats, as we become professionals. And so, we are always questioning the nature of policy analysts because they often have different motivations. And then we get into decisions, and decisions are made by highly placed elected officials, appointed officials accountable to elected officials, and senior civil servants. They all make public policy decisions. And decisions often in public policy are not made very quickly because they have to go through, various stepwise, kind of ladder-wise coordination efforts to ensure that they are actually completed. And often they also take a lot of time just to make the decisions themselves. Analysis is a complex endeavor. As we said, it was very multidisciplinary, so you might want to enlist the help of particular experts, conduct interviews, etc., to really make, a truly analytical analysis. So then we get into some different models of decision making, of which I believe there are 3 that we go over in the book, along with some other models that are not as focused on in this chapter. So the first model of decision making is the rational comprehensive decision making model, and this is historically the one that has been used the most in public policy and policy analysis. And so it's a model of decision making in which it is assumed that decision makers have nearly all information about a problem, its causes, and its solutions at their disposal, whereupon a large number of alternatives can be weighed and the best one selected. So this kind of goes with the rational actor model that we've discussed a little bit before, that is very common in economics and game theory. However, there are some critiques of this model, including that, first of all, it doesn't seem to be the case that the rational comprehensive decision model's specifications are often actually met. We don't have the unlimited computing power of a computer or an AI model. We don't have nearly all of the information about a problem at our disposal or its causes. Often in policy analysis, we're trying to determine what the causes of particular outcomes and outputs are. So to have that at the beginning of a decision-making process seems to be expecting too much of the average, policymaker. However, it incorporates in large part the component of cost-benefit analysis, which is a technique of policy analysis that seeks to understand the cost of a course of action and its benefits. When risk is introduced, the risk of something bad happening is also taken into account. This is essentially mathematical in nature. It's numerical in nature. It often comes down to being typically expressed in dollar amounts. So that's one. And then we have bounded rationality and incrementalism. Bounded rationality is a term used most prominently by Marsh and Simon that describes how decision makers seek to act as rationally as possible within certain boundary limits. These limits include limited time, limited information, and our limited human ability to recognize every feature and pattern of every problem. So the bounded rationality decision-making model is essentially a response to the critiques that were imposed on the rational comprehensive decision-making model. So we take some of those critiques and reevaluate the theory and kind of come up with a new one, or a new model. So instead of people having unlimited computational ability, information, time, in the bounded rationality model, and in a sense you get the idea from the word bounded in the title, we actually have limited amounts of these capacities, which seems to be more in accord with how, the human experience of the world actually is. However, this may be expecting, a critique is that this may be expecting too little of our policymakers or our decision makers. And again, these models are applicable not only to public policy and policy analysis, but other elements of public policy and other elements of political science, and even beyond that, other elements of sociology, philosophy, etc. Anyone who has to make a decision can think about these different models of decision making. So, is it saying, is it expecting too little of the decision maker and, granting that they are limited in a series of ways? So that's one critique. And then incrementalism is the last main one, which is a model of decision making in which policy change is accomplished through small incremental steps that allow decision makers to adjust policies as they learn from their successes and failures. And this seems to be, in the United States' history of policy restraint, which we discussed earlier on in the semester, incrementalism seems to be very popular as a model of decision making, where small kind of incremental policy steps or policy actions are taken that build on each other to certain conclusions or certain main policies, and sweeping change is difficult to occur. And that's the main critique of incrementalism, which is that, sometimes the demands of things like human rights, civil rights, etc., require that more sweeping policy change be made in a shorter amount of time than incrementalism would allow for. So in that sense, you might want to prefer a different model of decision making. And we get into some other models of decision making on the last slide here, such as the garbage can model, organizational process, and governmental politics. So the garbage can model is a model of decision making developed by Cohen, March, and Olson, who argued that organizations are organized anarchies and make decisions based on the flow of problems, solutions, and participants into choice opportunities they call garbage cans. This is the foundation of Kingan's multiple streams approach, which we will go over in the last weeks of the class when we talk about theories of public policy more broadly. So, essentially all these different problems, solutions, ideas, decision-making models, and participants combine together into this garbage can of which it spouts out different policy options. And this is an interesting model because it doesn't really suggest that any one policy alternative is better than the others. It's just more of a model of how things actually occur, and it kind of explains the distinction or the differentiation between various policy outputs that might come out of things like the garbage can of ideas. And then we also have the organizational process model, which is model 2. According to Brooklyn's taxonomy. And this incorporates bounded rationality as well as standard operating systems and bureaucracy. So the organizational process decision-making model essentially aligns with what we understand to be how bureaucracies operate. So there's a lot of chain of command, there's a lot of incremental decision-making, participants in the policy process are boundedly rational, and they have to kind of, go up the ladder to make their certain decisions real, or, codified, finally. And then we also have governmental politics, which is a model of political conflict where decision-making is slow, competitive, and likely to reflect the power of the relative actors more than the ultimate desirability of the decision at hand. So like the organizational process model, which is bound up with bureaucracy, so is the governmental politics model, because we operate in a bureaucracy in the United States and abroad. And so decision-making becomes slow, competitive, and reflective of the power of each of the participants rather than the merits of the decision itself. So in your policy analysis papers, I'm asking you to essentially use some probably the decision-making models of rational, comprehensive, and bounded rationality more than any others, rather than these bureaucratic models such as organizational process, governmental process, politics, and garbage can models, because you are not really considering, the stepwise power, influence, actions that bureaucrats and policymakers would have to take to make their policies real. Because you're not actually putting these policies into effect. However, one criteria that I call on you guys to use, and I have responded to some people who have asked about this, and responded with, the idea that you should use this, is political feasibility, which incorporates these models a little more than rational, comprehensive, and bounded rationality, and even incrementalism, although that that one is more organizational, more bureaucratic in nature. So, political feasibility refers to how likely is this to be accomplished in our current political climate. And so that gets at the ideas of these more bureaucratic organizational models. So essentially on the quiz, what I'm going to ask you guys to do is, I'm going to give you, let's see, I'll choose between either which model of decision making do you think is the most appropriate to solve X problem, and I'm not going to tell you what the problem is. And then, or I might ask you about outputs and outcomes. So definitely review those issues. And otherwise, that's all for today. Again, your Quiz 6 and your policy analysis paper are both due by this upcoming Friday in 4 days. 4 or 5 days, I guess, depending on how you consider it. Friday, June 25th by 11:59 p.m. Let me know if you have any questions about anything. And I might also send out an anonymous survey just to get kind of a mid-semester check on how you guys are feeling about the course. That would essentially just ask you, what do you like about the course? What don't you like about the course? What would you suggest to improve the course? And it would be anonymous, and it would be optional, but I would probably give you guys some extra credit just ahead of time for doing it. So, anyway, that's all for this week. I hope you guys have a great first day of summer today and a great week, and hopefully spend some time outside. Let me know if you have any questions about anything. I'm always here. And otherwise, be well, be safe, have a great week. Bye.